Good evening. Let's start tonight with something that on its face sounds simple, a yes. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has agreed to join what is being called the Board of Peace, a new international body launched by US President Donald Trump. That is the fact, that is the headline. But as is so often the case, the yes only makes sense when you understand the no that came before it. Because this agreement did not arrive cleanly, it did not arrive quickly, and it did not arrive without friction. Netanyahu's acceptance came only after initial objections from Israel, objections that were not vague, objections that were specific, stated, and tied directly to how this Board of Peace is structured and who is sitting at the table. And that matters. Because this board is not an abstract idea. It is directly linked to President Trump's post-war Gaza peace and reconstruction plan. That connection is explicit. The board is not symbolic. It is designed to be involved. And when a body like that is formed, especially one tied to Gaza, especially one involving multiple regional actors, who is included and who has influence becomes the story. Or rather, becomes the thing you need to understand before the story makes sense at all. The Board of Peace, as launched by President Trump, is described as an international body. Countries from the Middle East and beyond were invited. Some accepted quickly, others did not. Israel, at first, was not comfortable with what it saw. According to reporting, Israeli officials raised concerns about the board's structure. Those concerns focused particularly on the inclusion of Turkey and Qatar. Not hypothetically, not in the abstract, specifically. Israel objected to aspects of how the board would operate and how governance roles would be distributed. In other words, who would have a say and how much of one? And for Israel, those questions were not academic. Turkey and Qatar were named directly as points of concern. Their inclusion on the board raised red flags for Israeli officials, and those concerns were raised before Netanyahu agreed to join. That sequence is important. First the objections, then the agreement. And in between, something happened. Now, what we know, factually and only factually, is this. Netanyahu has now accepted the invitation. He has agreed to join the board. That acceptance was announced by his office. It marks a shift from earlier hesitation. But the earlier hesitation doesn't disappear just because the answer changed. And that's where tonight's focus really is. Because this is not a case of Israel being unaware of what it was signing up for. This is a case of Israel seeing the structure, objecting to parts of it, and then ultimately deciding to participate anyway. Which raises a quiet human question, not a political one, not a speculative one, just a human one. What changed? Now, we are not going to answer that question with guesses. We are not going to fill in gaps with assumption. We are going to stay strictly within what has been reported. What has been reported is that Netanyahu's decision came after those initial objections were known, and that the board remains linked to Trump's Gaza plan. The Board of Peace is described as part of a post-war vision, reconstruction, governance, stabilization. Those are the terms that surround it. And Israel, by joining, is now formally part of that structure. That is not nothing. This board includes countries that have varying relationships with Israel, some cooperative, some tense, some complicated. And again, Turkey and Qatar were highlighted as specific points of discomfort for Israel early on. Those concerns were not about diplomacy in general, they were about governance roles, about influence, about how decisions would be made. That is what Israeli officials objected to. And yet, here we are. Netanyahu has said yes. There is a moment, when you step back from the headlines, where this feels less like a dramatic pivot and more like a careful recalibration. Because joining does not mean endorsing every aspect. But not joining means being absent from decisions that will happen anyway. And that, too, is a fact of international bodies. One quiet line from reporting captures it best. It's not dramatic, it's not inflammatory, but it lands. This is about being inside the room, not outside the door. That's not a quote from an official. It's a way of understanding the situation. And it feels emotionally like it fits. Israel raised objections. Israel was uncomfortable. And Israel still chose to participate. That is the opening frame. Because once Netanyahu accepts, the board is no longer hypothetical for Israel. It becomes operational. It becomes something Israel is part of, rather than something happening elsewhere. And from a governance perspective, from a post-war Gaza perspective, that distinction matters. This is not about approval or disapproval. This is about positioning. And that positioning comes after resistance. Which brings us to the deeper question of how this board is meant to function, and what joining it actually entails. Because the name, Board of Peace, sounds lofty, but the mechanics are where the reality lives. And that's where we go next. Sometimes, as one line sticks with me tonight, agreement doesn't mean comfort, it just means presence. So let's stay with this moment. Because once Israel moves from objection to participation, the thing itself deserves a closer look. What is this Board of Peace exactly that drew early resistance and eventual agreement? Factually, it is a newly launched international body created by US President Donald Trump. It is directly linked to his post-war Gaza peace and reconstruction plan. That linkage is not implied. It is explicit in how the board has been described. This is not a ceremonial council. It is not a discussion forum with no consequence. It is designed to be part of the architecture around Gaza after the war. And that design is what triggered concern. When the board was first introduced, multiple countries were invited to participate. Some accepted quickly, others hesitated. Israel's hesitation was among the most clearly articulated. Israeli officials objected to aspects of the board's structure. They raised concerns about governance roles. That phrase, governance roles, does a lot of work here. It refers to who participates in decision-making, who has influence, who helps shape outcomes. Those concerns were not abstract. They were tied to specific countries. Turkey and Qatar. Those two names appear consistently in reporting as central to Israel's discomfort with the board's makeup. Their inclusion raised questions for Israel about how the board would function and who would hold sway. Now, it's important to pause here and stay disciplined. We are not assigning motives. We are not interpreting intent. We are not adding historical backstory beyond what has been reported. We are simply observing what was stated. Israel objected to the inclusion of Turkey and Qatar in governance roles within the board. That is the reported fact. And those objections were made before Netanyahu agreed to join. The Board of Peace itself has been described as international in scope. Countries from the Middle East and beyond are involved. It is tied to plans for Gaza after the war, including reconstruction. That is the framework. And within that framework, Israel saw potential problems. One way to understand this, without speculating, is to recognize that governance bodies matter not just because they exist, but because of how they are structured. Who sits where? Who votes? Who leads? Who advises? Who executes? Israel raised concerns about that structure. And then, after those concerns were known, Netanyahu accepted the invitation. That sequence is the spine of this section, because it suggests that the decision was not impulsive. It was not uninformed. It was made with awareness of the board's composition and purpose. Which brings us to the board's broader makeup. Several countries have joined the Board of Peace. Reporting confirms participation from countries across the region. Others have declined or expressed hesitation. But Israel's case stands out because of how openly its concerns were reported before its acceptance. This was not a quiet internal debate, it was visible. And then the decision shifted. Netanyahu's office announced that he would join. No public reversal of concerns was reported. No declaration that the structure had changed was stated publicly, just the acceptance. Which means that Israel is now part of a body it previously questioned. That is not unusual in international diplomacy, but it is revealing. Because participation confers both responsibility and influence. It also limits the ability to object from the outside. Once inside, the objections become part of the process rather than a reason to abstain. And that may be the most factual way to understand this move. Israel did not abandon its concerns. It chose engagement over absence. The Board of Peace, tied to Gaza's post-war future, will move forward whether or not Israel participates. By joining, Israel ensures it is present in discussions linked to reconstruction and governance. Again, that is not interpretation, that is a structural reality of international bodies. If you are not at the table, decisions still happen. And that leads us to a quiet but resonant line tonight. Sometimes participation is not endorsement, it's insurance. That line doesn't add information, it doesn't assign motive, it simply captures the emotional logic of the situation as it stands. Israel objected to the board's structure. Israel questioned who would have governance roles, and Israel joined anyway. The board exists, the plan exists, the invitations were sent, and Netanyahu said yes. That yes does not erase the concerns, it reframes them, because now those concerns will be expressed from within the structure, rather than from the outside looking in. And that is where the significance of this decision really lives. Not in the announcement itself, but in what participation changes. It changes leverage, it changes access, it changes how objections are voiced. This is not a dramatic pivot, it is a measured step into a process Israel had already scrutinized. Which brings us to the final piece. What this acceptance means in the context of Gaza's post-war planning, and how this moment closes a loop that began with resistance. There is a sense, reading the reporting closely, of a door that was never fully closed, just held ajar, and now stepped through. 1 foot inside, as the line goes, is still inside. So now we come to the end of this arc, and it is important to be precise about where it actually ends. Benjamin Netanyahu has accepted the invitation to join President Donald Trump's Board of Peace. That decision is now settled. It is public. It has been announced. And yet acceptance does not magically resolve the tensions that came before it. It does something quieter. It changes where those tensions live. Because before this acceptance, Israel's concerns about the board's structure, its governance roles, and the inclusion of Turkey and Qatar existed outside the framework of the board itself. They were objections raised from a distance. Now those same concerns exist inside the room. That distinction matters, even if nothing else changes immediately. The Board of Peace remains linked to Trump's post-war Gaza peace and reconstruction plan. That connection has not shifted. The purpose of the board has not been redefined. The countries involved have not been reselected. What has changed is Israel's position relative to the process. By joining, Israel becomes a participant rather than an observer. That is the factual outcome of this decision. And that participation comes after resistance, not instead of it. This is not a case where objections were never raised. They were raised, reported, and understood. They centered on governance, influence, and the presence of specific countries. Those facts remain part of the record, which means that Netanyahu's acceptance should not be read as a blank check or as a declaration that all concerns have evaporated. Nothing in the reporting suggests that. What it suggests instead is a decision to engage with a structure that is moving forward regardless. The Board of Peace was launched. Invitations were extended. Countries responded in different ways. Some joined, some declined, some hesitated. Israel hesitated. Then Israel joined. That sequence, taken on its own terms, tells us something important without requiring speculation. It tells us that the board's existence and trajectory were significant enough that remaining outside it was not the preferred option for Israel, even with unresolved concerns. And again, that is not a judgment. It is a description of the outcome. When a body is designed to play a role in post-war planning, particularly around Gaza, absence has consequences. Presence does too, and Netanyahu chose presence. There is a temptation in moments like this to frame the decision as dramatic or decisive, but the reporting does not support that tone. This reads more like a calculated step into an imperfect process, a process Israel had already examined closely, a process Israel had already criticized, and a process Israel is now part of. That is the full picture. Nothing in the available facts suggests a sudden change of heart about Turkey or Qatar. Nothing indicates that the board's governance structure was fundamentally altered before Israel joined. The acceptance stands alongside the objections, not in place of them. And that coexistence is the key to understanding what this moment is and what it is not. It is not a resolution of disagreements. It is not an endorsement of every element of the board. It is an acknowledgement that the board will proceed, and that participation offers a different kind of influence than opposition from the sidelines. There is a line that feels appropriate here, and it is simple. Being there doesn't mean agreeing, it means being heard. That line does not add information, it does not claim intent, it just reflects the emotional logic of engagement in international structures. Netanyahu's acceptance places Israel inside a body linked to Gaza's post-war future. That is the factual endpoint. Everything else, the concerns, the discomfort, the unresolved questions, travels with that decision rather than disappearing. And that, in a way, is how many international processes actually work. Not with clean conclusions, not with perfect alignment, but with countries stepping into frameworks they have reservations about, because the alternative is having no seat at all. This is where the script closes, because this is where the facts end. There is an invitation, there are objections, there is an acceptance, and now there is participation. No more, no less. Sometimes the most revealing decisions are not the loud ones, but the ones that quietly place you inside a process you once resisted. And sometimes the headline is simply this: the door opened and the step was taken.